Please welcome from the Weather Channel, Stephanie Abrams, and from NBC News, Zinhle Essamuah.
Good morning, everybody. Everyone feeling good? Ready for another round? We made it to Friday.
Day two.
Day two here. So, we're glad you guys are here. We hope your bellies are full, and we have a lot of great stuff happening today, a lot of interactive stuff that will happen today. Later this morning, we're going to transition into those working groups that we were talking about yesterday, that we did all those notes that are on the back wall there, and have a town hall discussion. So start thinking about those topics and maybe what groups that you want to go into so that you can do that a little bit later this afternoon. And we're going to talk about things like power of local, needs of visuals. A lot of people are talking about, why don't we have any visuals, right? The need to integrate that. And it's not just an afterthought when we're discussing climate, also combating disinformation. We all know that we need to do that.
There's so much we need to do, and we covered so many topics yesterday. So we also hope you'll keep talking, and I could hear the buzzing when everyone entered. Keep talking, keep connecting, because there's so much to dig into today. So to kick off today, we have another short presentation, but we also want to open up the floor as we start the morning. Things are going to be in a bit of an altered order, so roll with us, but we want to open up the floor for a little Q&A with our upcoming panelists. So please join me in welcoming to the stage from Telemundo 51 Miami meteorologist Ariel Rodriguez, and from WTJV NBC 6 South Florida meteorologist Steve McLaughlin.
Go get them, boys.
Hello, good morning.
Sorry. Don't worry about it.
It's affirming to just, I think, be in a room with other people who are kind of experiencing some of the same struggles.
Being in a community with one another is honestly really important.
I feel a different person than when I arrived.
I really resonated with the idea of focusing on solutions as opposed to the problems.
It's important when covering solutions to really get into their limitations and think critically.
If we don't focus on justice and equity, we are not really focusing on climate.
And making sure that it relates to all of the facets of our communities.
How newsrooms are talking about bringing stories from the global south to international audiences, and how newsrooms can sort of make that shine.
Talking about this narrative shift between gloom and doom to hope and possibility, and we have to have hope.
It feels optimistic and hopeful. It feels like, if anyone knows that the solutions exist, we just need to teach people about them and implement them, it's the people in this room. And so that really does come through, I think.
I would take away a renewed sense of optimism that we're not screwed, that we can make really important changes, and that journalism has a really important role to play in that process.
Awesome. And I wanted to begin by saying that let's give a hand to the production team, because they turned this around really quick. While we were having some drinks yesterday, they were making this happen, and it looks awesome. And now we'll show another video, and this pertains to what we'll be talking about, especially what Steve did this past summer. Let's go.
This spot I'm standing right now, like so many other parts of Big Pine, was completely obliterated after Hurricane Irma. So Monroe County has bought this land, and their hope is that no one will ever build here again. And here's the reason why. Every fall when we get the king tides or the astronomically high tides, the ocean rises, and I'd be standing knee-deep in water right now. That means if anyone does eventually decide to build here, they're going to be dealing with sunny day flooding for as long as they own their home. Behind me is the southernmost point in the continental United States, one of the most iconic spots in all of South Florida. But what if I told you that within the next few decades, this spot could be underwater? And if that happens, this spot will no longer be the southernmost point. Adaptation is 100% necessary. Mitigation is 100% necessary. But we have to have an adult conversation about retreat, because retreat is inevitable. The question is, do we want that retreat to be proactive and managed and equitable, or do we want it to be chaotic and reactive where wealthy people can keep adapting and people with less money have no options left.
Awesome. So with that, we're kicking off our presentation, and I'm Ariel Rodriguez, meteorologist at Telemundo 51, and also part of the Beacon Newsroom project from Solutions Journalism Network. I wanted to first say thank them for this very enlightening process. And with that, Steve, talk to me about your stories.
Okay, so Ariel came to me about a year ago, and he said, we have this new project, and I'd like you to help work on it. And the idea is solutions-based journalism. So we had been doing climate change reporting forever. Also have to give a shout out right there to Angie Lastman, who we used to work with, who did also amazing climate change coverage. You can now see her on NBC Network. Congratulations on that. We miss you. But our work as a team was already sort of happening. I wanted to just go back 10, 20, 30 years ago. So we both worked at NBC in Dallas, and Mr. O'Brien was here yesterday. I don't know if he's here today. He was our general manager. We were not allowed to talk about climate change. Okay, I worked there from 2000 to 2004 to 2010. Okay,
it was Texas in the mid 2000s.
But it was the world in at that time. Nobody was allowed to talk about climate change. We even had that segment Going Green, but it was Going Green, just don't talk about climate change. Now here we are, fast forward to 2023. Not only is it encouraged, it is now required that Ariel and I are producing climate content every single day.
Yeah, I would even say it's been expected, especially after being involved in the Climate Beacon Newsroom project. And let's just start with that. Once we started on this project, and I have to say that contrary to other experiences, we've always been very enabled by our managers. They've always been very adamant about letting us work on this type of stories. And even though we sometimes are limited on time and resources, the push for us to work on stories, it's always there. And this is something that we'll talk a little bit more as we move on. I just kind of wanted to talk about my experience. It's never been negative. I started doing climate stories way back in around 2013, and I also worked on series, and I did a lot of environmental stories. And I have never been harassed by anyone in terms of any type of political background or association with climate. I think that the South Florida population, regardless of, political spectrum colors, it's very attuned to our needs and how climate affects us in many different ways. So that opens up a portal for us to talk about these things. Once we started working on the Climate Beacon project, we wanted to go full-blown onto solutions journalism and talk about not only climate but also environmental issues that affected us. And Steve did this wonderful piece on managed retreat, and I worked on microplastics. My main goal once we started was to get the duopoly involved. We are a duopoly station, Telemundo 51 and NBC6. We're owned by Comcast, NBC Universal. And we work together very cohesively as one TV station, even though we do it in different languages. So from the get-go, my idea was to get everyone involved, and we also got other reporters involved and other meteorologists involved. And I also had the chance to do it not only in Spanish, which is what I always do, but also do it in English. And why don't you talk to me, Steve, about the experience with, and also the differences in between how meteorologists and reporters reacted to this experience of solutions journalism?
Yeah, so I would say we're going to skip ahead, I guess, to what we learned, because that's really what we're here to talk about. I went in with one idea. I wanted to produce a story about how wasteful beach replenishment is and how silly it is to just keep putting sand in the same places over and over and over. And when I pitched that to my coach at the time was Sophie, who's not here with us, she said, that's fine, but that's not going to be enough. And she said, have you ever considered managed retreat? And of course, I'd heard the term, but I really didn't know anything about it. And she's like, I can help you make a couple contacts. Anyway, Why are meteorologists maybe great at solutions journalism? Because solutions journalism is a scientific process. You need to let the river take you. I went in with this idea of the story I was going to tell. It was going to be a 3-minute package on, the wastefulness of beach replenishment. It turned into a 22-minute documentary on managed retreat. And as I was starting to tell the story of managed retreat, I realized, oh, wait a minute. I can't tell the story of managed retreat unless I tell the story of chaotic retreat and climate gentrification, because that's all connected, right? Because if people are retreating, wealthy people tend to be the ones who get to take that land or can move to somewhere more expensive. So I used Hurricane Irma as an example because the Florida Keys are literally disappearing. The Florida Keys will not be there forever. In fact, in our lifetime, many of the smaller keys will be gone. And then it begs the question, well, how do you get to Key West if all the bridges are gone? So this story, I had no idea what I was doing, but I went in with a scientist and I said, just let the river guide me. And that's how I was able to just build and build and build. One source would give me 20 more sources. I'd interview all 20 people. I have them on camera. If you watch the documentary, you'll see there's a lot of experts. That's because I needed these people to tell this story, and it just ended up going in a direction I had no plans for. So maybe my scientific mind was sort of like I was trying to do an experiment in college, where you're just like, let me go in with a hypothesis, but then let the river take me to wherever it goes, and that's how we got the documentary. I think your documentary, you knew going in what you were doing. You were doing plastics. You just didn't know that you were going to have 22 minutes of material.
Yes, and I also didn't know I was producing it in both languages, so at the
Sorry
end,
about that would be my fault.
Different documentaries.
He's better at English than I am at Spanish, so.
But it was definitely a learning experience, and for all of you getting started on solutions journalism, my best advice is go into this project or this type of stories with an open mind. Things will change, especially if you're working on a long-term kind of format like we did, because it was first a long-term type format documentary, and then we split it into different packages, which is what we call it on TV, which are stories. You did about 5 stories. I also had 5 stories. So you need to have an open mind. You need to be able to let your story change, and of course you always have to have in mind the 4 pillars of solutions journalism, which is what really set your stories apart. Just wanted to mention that the fact that meteorologists are seen as such a trustworthy source of information by the community also lends itself to more impact by these stories, which at the end help us give a more positive message, because people want solutions to problems that we have. Also wanted to talk about our experience with reporters was a little mixed in terms of maybe they went into this with a more set mind, being
a journalist.
Mm-hmm. I didn't consider myself a journalist. I mean, I went to school for meteorology. I got a bachelor's, a master's, and you went to school for meteorology as well.
Meteorology and journalism. I actually knew I was going to do both, so thank you, Rutgers University.
Yeah, I got into journalism by chance. So the journalist part was difficult because they were more stubborn, let's just say that. It's easier sometimes when you don't know something to accept and break the mold, and sometimes it's harder for people that come to it with a preconceived notion to let themselves go. But still, we got some good content, and I'll have a presentation of our project later on, and I'll talk more about it. But at the end, we had great results, and our news directors are extremely happy, and there might be some other projects in the works, which I heard in the last couple days, and I'm pushing to get solutions journalism as one of the main concentrations.
So the main reason why we're here is to talk about how this project changed our newsroom. And if nothing else, I think so many great things came of this project. I'm so proud of the work both of us did, but the most important thing, and I think the thing that will resonate, is we have a different newsroom now. We have an aggressive group of producers, so aggressive that most days I might walk into the building now thinking I'll just focus on the hurricane or the weather, and a producer will come up to me and be like, hey, can I add this VO to your weathercast? We've got this great thing on climate change. Like, everyone's thinking climate now. I can go to a producer now, and I can say, I want to add this thing to my weathercast. Climate Central sent us this great graphic. I want to throw it in. Can you give me an extra 30 seconds? We've become accustomed now to understanding that if a meteorologist is asking for more time to do climate coverage, they're going to get it now. The other thing that we really learned is, you know, in Miami, we have a busy season and a quiet season. If you've not been to Miami in, you know, December, January, and February, please come. It's amazing. But we also have a lot of time on our hands because there's not a lot of weather to talk about. That documentary I produced took about 3 months, but it had to take place in the winter. I would not be able to produce that now because it's our busy season, and hurricanes, you know, take precedence. That's what we do. But what I learned is that in the quieter season, I can produce a long-form documentary. I have the resources, the time. In the summer, what I can do every single day is put climate change coverage into my weathercast. I don't have to get it approved. I don't have to write a script. I just throw it in there. Now, I know not everyone in here is an on-air meteorologist, but for me, you know, I want people to say, hey, I want to watch Steve today because I want to see what he's going to say about the 101-degree ocean temperature in Manatee Bay. And by the way, every day in the month of July, literally every day, I did a climate change story at the top of every weathercast. Why? Because it was the hottest July we've ever seen, and that 101 ocean temperature was so easy for people to digest. And more people commented on the climate change coverage than any forecast I've ever had.
That's right. And like I told you, our time ran out. We talk too much. We're used to it, and our time was it's never enough for meteorologists. But thank you so much for letting us talk to you about this. And if you have any questions, let us know later. Thank you.
That was really great, guys. I need to watch that. That's really good. I need to somehow get a hold of that. That was really good. All right, we are now honored to have with us this morning from the White House, National Climate Advisor and Assistant to the President, Ali Zaidi. Of course, he is a longtime advisor to President Biden, having provided counsel and leadership on climate policy development, legislation, and executive action from day one of the administration. In fact, we interviewed him on his first day at Climate Week here, I remember that, during the presidential transition in Biden's 2020 campaign. Zaidi also served in leadership roles for climate change and energy during the Obama-Biden administration. He was New York's chairman of climate policy and finance and deputy secretary for energy and environment, where he led the state's efforts on climate change and clean energy. Please help me welcome Mr. Zaidi. Thank you for being with us. Good to see you. Oh, sorry, I didn't know you didn't have a lob. There you go. Okay. Hi.
Hello. Hello.
Everyone's really excited to have you here, and we're going to ask some questions in a little bit. But first, let's talk about, you know, some of the journalists might not be as familiar with your role in the Biden administration. Can you briefly explain your responsibilities and how they do or don't overlap with John Kerry or the head of the EPA?
So on day one of the administration, and thank you for having me here, on day one of the administration, the president set up a new office in the White House called the Climate Policy Office. And for the first time, and it was headed at the time by my predecessor and my dear friend, Gina McCarthy, who had previously been head of the EPA in the Obama years. It was set up to have in it two critical capabilities. The first was subject matter expertise in every sector of the economy. So folks who knew something about buildings, decarbonization, agriculture and lands, transportation, electricity, and so on. And then folks who understood the sort of cross-cutting currents in climate, analytical capability, data innovation. And our job has been from day one to advise the president, of course, day to day, but also to bring together the full government on solutions that oftentimes require handoffs. So Michael Regan runs the EPA, but you know, for power plants to be built to respond to, for example, his regulations, we need the Department of Energy funding certain innovation. We need the Department of Interior siting and permitting lines. So it requires different parties coming to the table. Our job is to convene that. The other big piece of business for us right at the outset of the administration was to formulate, design, propose, and then negotiate what became the biggest climate law passed by any country anywhere in the world.
Which we're going to get to in a minute. But first, we had the opportunity to interview President Biden on the Weather Channel last month, and we asked him about declaring a climate emergency, and he said he had, quote, practically speaking, he had done that. But at this point, he hasn't used all the executive orders in his disposal to do things like halt crude oil exports or suspend the offshore drilling. Explain why this administration doesn't think it's necessary.
I think the president from day one has directed his team to constantly, it's not a point in time effort, to constantly be evaluating new authorities, existing authorities, to assess their efficacy in delivering what is promised, and understand their durability from a litigation perspective and administrative challenges to getting those done. So I'll give you one example of something we just did this week, right? So, we passed the Inflation Reduction Act a year ago. We've taken many steps since then. Just this week, we launched the American Climate Corps. This was the product of a proposal that the president put out during the campaign. It was part of the Build Back Better legislation. It did not get enacted. Then we sort of took a step back, looked at our executive authorities, our tools. We've now stood up, as of this week, a corps that will not only enlist young people in the work of climate change, but deliver them a streamlined pathway to long-term jobs and federal service, a educational benefit through executive authority. So we're constantly looking at new ways to go faster and faster. That's thing number one. Thing number two is there's a real canon on emergency powers in the space. In fact, some of the law scholars that sit on this campus have literally written the book on the topic. And when you double click on climate emergency, there are very specific, and I'm giving you the long form answer, but
that's okay.
Like meteorologists, climate advisors sometimes go long, I guess. The long form answer. So when you double click on it, there are a number of authorities that people refer to when they say climate emergency. One big part of the canon was an encouragement to the president to use special authority under their trade powers, the Section 232 tariff power, other authorities under the Trade Act. This president has done that. So he used extraordinary authority to stabilize the supply situation for solar panels, and it was predicated on the need on an emergency basis to take action because of climate and because of our energy security. So that's one example. Another place that the emergency scholarship talks about is in just the general trade with countries. There, we're using the authority to negotiate for the first time a clean steel and aluminum arrangement with the European Union. That's part of that climate emergency scholarship. One of the big powers that folks talk about when they talk about climate emergency is the wartime powers under the Defense Production Act. Those wartime powers are being used and have been used multiple times in this administration. The president used, for example, you guys have seen the wildfires burning out west. What is probably underreported is all of what goes into fighting those, not just the 16,000 wildland firefighters, but all the equipment that they need. We found ourselves a couple of summers ago without this is the nature of the catastrophe. We did not have enough hoses to go fight the fire. And the last factory in the United States that manufactured these hoses had shut down. So the president used his Defense Production Act wartime power to stand that factory back up and deliver those resources. He's used that again in heat pumps, which, by the way, this fall we will actually have some of that money out into specific companies. So I think what he's talked about is his team is constantly evaluating new tools, assessing them for efficacy, operational resilience, durability, and we keep looking. So I don't think there's a judgment here that we're done. It's in fact we are continuing to go and look at additional tools.
So because of all those different tools you have, you don't think you'll have to do an overall climate emergency. Is that what you're saying?
So there is no, I think what I'm saying is there are lots of different statutes that have emergency powers embedded in them. and we continue to look at whether it's emergency powers or not to pursue additional action. And we will absolutely continue to do that. And can I say a thing about durability, why it matters? So folks may remember in his day one executive order, the president put a pause on leasing. That pause was paused by the Louisiana District Court, and then it stayed that way in the Fifth Circuit. It also resulted in taking away some of the discretion from the Interior Department in its management of offshore waters. That litigation did. So we've got to think about action in a way that doesn't take our discretion away to do the more responsible thing. And that's part of when I say durability. It's we've got a court system that we're accountable to, and we've got to work to meet those folks where they are.
You mentioned the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA, which we all call it. What would you say is the biggest success story to come out of that and the biggest obstacle?
I think the runaway success story 1 year in to the Inflation Reduction Act is that it has sparked really an unprecedented manufacturing renaissance around the country. People sometimes, this is like a new thing, but they complain that the Inflation Reduction Act has been too successful. This is a Washington phenomena, not a outside of Washington phenomena. But you know, there was an assessment of how much uptake there would be of these tax credits. And now there are people in Washington complaining that there's too much manufacturing relocating to the United States, and there's been too much uptake of manufacturing tax credits. But here's what this looks like on the ground. 100 factories and counting of clean energy products stamped Made in America. These factories are showing up mostly in places where opportunity had left before. Weirton, West Virginia, where a steel plant had shuttered. Now there is a battery factory that is up and humming. Dalton, Georgia, used to be the sofa manufacturing capital of the world. That opportunity left that community. Now they're the solar manufacturing capital of the world. In Farmington, New Mexico, they had a power generating station that went away. Now they are building a solar farm there and working with the Navajo Nation to move those electrons across their lands. So all across the country, not only we're seeing a massive manufacturing renaissance, we're seeing it turn opportunity back on in places where it had left.
So what would you say is the biggest obstacle then on the other side of that?
I think one of the biggest obstacles that we see right now is our ability to get the stuff built, the actual project. So we're talking about the manufacturing coming back online. Part of that responds to supply chain limitations in this space. You know, if you talk to people who are building solar projects or even people in the EV space over the last couple of years, you've heard them talk about supply chain limitations. So all these factories are coming to meet that demand in the future, but in this middle period, there have been some constraints there. The other constraint in building has been getting the permitting done at the state and local level. And part of that is because we have, as you know, a society, really underinvested in our capability to review big infrastructure projects and get them through the process in a way that engages communities, that's responsible. So we're, as a federal government, investing a lot of money in that permitting capability. I know states like New York are, but we're going to need to continue to ramp that up because this is the infrastructure decade. There's a lot of demand on the system to review these projects and get them built.
And with that said, there's a lot of subsidies that the IRA is offering when you're talking about the adaptation of solar and wind and other forms of clean energy. But the IRA virtually, it really doesn't do a lot to phase out fossil fuels. So what's the administration's strategy given the overwhelming science that we must immediately reduce the carbon emissions?
So number one, I think you're right in characterizing that the primary focus of the Inflation Reduction Act is to de-risk the deployment of clean energy. And it does that through consumer credits and credits to businesses. It does it through lending programs. It does it through direct investment to rural cooperatives, to farms, to forests, to multifamily housing, and so on. One of the strongest strategies we have on limiting the emissions from fossil fuels is to reduce the demand for the fossil fuels. You think about our vehicle fleet, over 200 million vehicles. Those vehicles run for 10 to 15 years on average. Those are demanding a certain amount of motor gasoline. We have to get alternatives out there that are affordable to people. And what's been exciting is to see states and the private sector step up to even add more incentives in terms of getting this out. In Colorado, for example, not only do you get the $7,500 federal credit, you get a state rebate, and Xcel Energy, which is the utility there, is helping get that out. In terms of in addition to reducing the demand, we've got to manage the future of supply as well. There is a near-term need to maintain stable supplies. I think you all, maybe the most popular segment on the nightly news is the weather. The probably second most popular thing on the news is gasoline prices, right? Folks want to know where that's at. So there is a near-term play in this, and frankly, the president has done a lot to make sure that at this moment of consumer cost inflation produced by the pandemic, produced by the Russian aggression and other macroeconomic headwinds, that were there for consumers. But he's conserved over 20 million acres of land. Just earlier this year, or earlier this month rather, he announced massive expansion of protections in the Alaskan North Slope. And one of the things this administration's done that's really path-breaking, and I say this having worked at different levels of government and in the federal government previously, is to require analysis around climate as part of whether it's infrastructure project development or it's new leasing decisions. That analysis is critical to inform decision-making that will help us align to where we need to go over the long run.
Let's dive into solar a little bit more here, because the Sunshine State, Florida, just surpassed Texas and California as a state with the most new solar projects in 2023, and yet Governor Ron DeSantis has shown disdain for the climate agenda. How do you scale things like renewable energy when this is the type of leadership that you're up against on the state level?
Well, you know, I was with a group of 25 governors yesterday that launched a new commitment to get 20 million heat pumps installed by 2030. Heat pumps, by the way, heat and cool, and they work in very cold climates. I had been in Maine actually this summer, where Governor Mills set a goal to deploy heat pumps 100,000 by 2027. By 2025, and they hit the goal 2 years early thanks to the Inflation Reduction Act. So we're seeing governors and state and local leaders step up in a big way. But yes, there are places where I think the leadership is doing a disservice to consumers by underinvesting in or trying to slow the pace of deployment of technologies like solar, which bring down consumer costs, or of energy efficiency retrofit monies. You mentioned Florida. You know, there's a massive opportunity to retrofit homes, especially for low and moderate income Floridians, and the state has been difficult about taking the resources that are allocated to it through the federal legislation and allowing it to flow to folks to help cut their energy bills. So I think that's a problem, to put it lightly. And this is about, you know, there's going to be accountability around this. We live in a democratic system where people get to express their frustration. And what we know is when it comes to solar, when it comes to efficiency, when it comes to vehicles, we're taking pollution out of the sky, we're putting money in people's pockets. Those are very powerful drivers for people to push their government to take action. And we hope and expect that that will happen.
Climate and weather are inextricably linked. $23 billion, I have to say it slowly because there's been $23 billion disasters so far in 2023, which is a new record already this year. Internationally, we've also seen just devastating, loss of life. This month we had all that flooding in Libya that killed thousands. What obligation does the U.S. have to protect these vulnerable communities here and also abroad with all these extreme weather events that are becoming really the new norm more and more?
Yeah, the new normal, I mean, you all know this, the new normal is frequent and severe extremes.
Yeah.
And we have a huge obligation to step up and provide the resources to adapt and be resilient before these events take place, and to stand shoulder to shoulder after they do, and not just leave a few weeks after, but really help rebuild. In the United States, we, through the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act, have over $50 billion flowing into the work of resilience, the front end work of resilience. And just to give you sort of the comparable statistic, when I worked in the Obama years, there was a moment where we had $1 billion to do resilience. And that was the biggest deal in the world. So think about that ambition level and that resource level increasing by a factor of 50, and us being able to be partners. What that looks like, just very concretely, since the infrastructure law has passed, the Forest Service, working with state and local partners, has managed over 1 million acres of forest land across the West, which means when the next fire shows up to those forests, there will be less fuel for it to burn more furiously and more quickly. That's a really important thing, and our goal is to do millions of acres more with the resources that we have. It means that we're investing in communities' capability to retrofit specifically. I give the example often of a children's hospital on the Florida coast that now has a cocoon built around it that allows the children's hospital to withstand up to Category 4 winds. Those are the kind of investments that the FEMA BRIC program allows communities to make. And we've got hundreds of those grants. This is not just sort of an abstract concept. Hundreds of those grants working specific projects now all across the country. And for all of these investments, whether it's the ones I've described or the investments to bury power lines so that they don't fall over and cause a fire, or the investments to raise infrastructure so roads don't wash out during the next flood, for all of these investments, the president has applied a program called Justice 40, which means 40% of the benefits of these investments have to flow to communities that are often left out, left behind, disadvantaged communities. We have a massive moral obligation globally as well, which is why the president's quadrupled adaptation funding. He just deposited $1 billion into the Green Climate Fund this year, which supports resilience and adaptation around the world. He's launched a Prepare effort, which brings our technical expertise, data, know-how, and makes it accessible for developing world. So we got to do this here. We've got to do it around the world. We've got to deal with the challenges we've unleashed, but we have to keep at, to your point, we have to keep at the root cause of this problem. The root cause of this problem is putting greenhouse gas emissions into the sky. That comes principally from uncontrolled combustion of fossil fuels, and we need to take on that problem shoulder squared and laser focused.
We're going to get to audience questions in just 1 minute here. I have to ask you, I love some good constructive criticism. And this is a room full of journalists in the media, right? So, IRA, let's turn to the IRA. What are your impressions of the media coverage? What are we doing good at? What are we falling short at? Of course, constructive criticism. Ali,
yeah, and I was reading some of the thoughts in the back of the room, which it feels like you all are very good at asking questions, not just of me, but of yourself as well, which is good. But the constructive criticism, both to you and to us, this is the thing we're working really hard at, is we've got to connect the dots for really busy people. This is a time when there are many parts of the economy that are going through shifts. People are coming out of the pandemic. They lost family members. Everybody knows someone they lost in just the last few years. Yeah. Think about, those things that drive stress in a person's life. The number one thing is usually the loss of a close relative. That's true for so many Americans in just the last few years. The number two thing is usually some displacement in their job. Think about all those people that lost jobs during the pandemic period. We've grown more jobs than ever before in the time since under President's leadership, but think about how close of a stress and a strain that is to people. So we can't just throw random darts of information out and expect people have the time to connect the dots. There are two places where I think we need to connect the dots. Number one is between the root cause and what we're seeing in terms of impacts. I don't think we do that enough. I think the thing that's right in front of you is the hurricane. The fact that it's drawing fuel with greater fury because the water is warm, and the water is warm because the entire planet is warming. Those are a lot of things to cover in 60 seconds. And so I get why it's hard to connect the dots, but I do think it's important. And when people do, when you all do, I think that's immensely powerful to help people understand there is a root cause driver to this weirding and this greater fierceness that they're seeing in their communities. The second is to connect the dots between the policy they unleashed and how it's actually making a difference. There's a lot to be to drive a sense of doom and despair in the climate discourse. Skies are turning orange. People are breathing in gunk into their lungs. Communities are getting leveled. There's a lot of reason to be despondent. And I think as I look over the last year, there's equal reason, if not more, to be very excited about the possibilities here. It wasn't Joe Biden acting unilaterally. It was Joe Biden working with the United States and the House of Representatives, a process that lots and lots of Americans participated in, to pass legislation that is bending the curve at an epic scale here in the United States on emissions and putting steel in the spine of countries all around the world to do the same thing, going after that root cause problem, and in the process delivering environmental justice, lifting up communities, creating jobs. So I think part of it is also, hey, we shouldn't be in paralysis or in a sense of throwing up our hands. We can't do anything about the root cause problem. We are. We got to go faster, but we are. And I think that's another place where giving people a reason to stay plugged into the process is really important. The democracy part of this, not the partisan part of this, the democracy part of this is so important. We got to reinvigorate that engine.
All right, I know there's a lot of questions, so it is time for the questions. You guys point me out where I need to go to. Yep.
Hi. So I'm Samantha from Impact Edition, based in Miami, and your comment about how DeSantis is in the way of bringing federal funds to Florida to further renewable energy projects. How do we cover that story without further polarizing Florida communities?
Yeah, look, this should not be a polarizing issue. I wish it weren't the way it is. The impacts don't swerve based on whether you lived in a red district or a blue one. Wildfires don't pick you based on who you voted for in the last election. And the solutions shouldn't skip over people based on who's representing them or who's running the government. I think it's really important. The way we've tried to focus on this is really just the substance and the bottom line for the American people and for folks around the country. This is about consumer costs. This is about jobs. This is about indoor air quality. This is about local air pollution. This is about reducing global emissions, and just helping people understand what sits on the other side of specific decisions, right? There are decisions that the government makes at the federal level, the president. There are decisions that are made by local governments and state governments all across the country. I think, very objectively, people just need to understand what are the cause and effect of the decisions, what are the implications, and frankly, what money and public health benefit and so on are we leaving on the table if we make a decision a certain way. That's what this is about. This is not about partisan ends. This is about delivering for the American people.
Hi, I'm Mark Hertzgaard. I'm the executive director and the co-founder of Covering Climate Now, which is one of the sponsors here. Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for being here with us. I've covered climate change for more than 20 years now, and I don't understand your answers about the emergency decision. And I'd like to know, how much of this is a political decision, calculation by the president that he doesn't want to deal with the political blowback of saying it's a climate emergency?
He said
How
that.
much of it is a legal decision? You mentioned the canon of law. But beyond that, why wouldn't he, if he really cares about shutting down the fossil fuels that you yourself say is what's driving this, and I think he understands that, why would he not take the authority that he does have to stop the oil exports, to stop the drilling on all of these levels, whether he calls it an emergency or not? You don't mention the Willow Project. Can you explain to us the thinking in the administration? Why has he not done these obvious things that, as you know, the young climate activists who helped him get elected and helped turn back that supposed red wave in 2022, they're not happy with him, rightly or wrongly. They say, yeah, great IRA, but what are you doing to stop the fossil fuels? Can you explain that to us?
Yeah. So number one, and thank you for the clarity of your question. I will try to oblige with a clarity in response. I'll try to say this again as clearly as I can. There are, when we talk about emergency, we're talking about a number of different statutory authorities, right? You're talking about tools under IEPA, under NEA, under the Defense Production Act, under the trade laws. We're talking about tools under the Stafford Act. And as a general matter, when you take action in the federal government, you assess each of these statutory tools based on your ability to operationalize them, administer them, and know that they can be durably used, right? And so, for example, in the previous administration, there was a use of an authority to use military construction funding to build a wall. There are folks who have said that we should use the military construction funding to build solar farms, right? That is, again, part of this canon of ideas, and we have not done that for a number of reasons. One, there are other intended uses for that money. Number two, there's a lot of litigation that's taken place that shows that's actually not a durable way to allocate those dollars, that it would not hold up. And third, we have secured funding for solar that far eclipses by orders of magnitude the ability and reach of what had been proposed. So that's one of the many statutes. And I think what I've said is we continue constantly to look at each of those tools, each of the prongs of what's available in terms of emergency power, and try to advance that. That's question number one.
Pardon me for interrupting, because I know my other colleagues want to ask questions. I'm not asking you about solar. I'm asking you, are you saying, let me point the question, are you saying then that the administration has decided it does not have the legal authority to do things like stopping a Willow project, stopping the oil exports, stopping, we're now 1/3 of the oil around this world is U.S. oil. So that's what I'm trying to understand. I don't understand why you're not taking the steps that you have the authority to, unless we're misunderstanding what your authorities are.
Yeah, respectfully, and I think I am trying to answer literally the question you said, so I can try it again. I was giving you an example of the first part of my answer, which is there are lots of authorities that we're talking about when we say emergency. You've said, why don't you declare an emergency? And I'm saying there are lots of legal tools. We are evaluating a lot of those legal tools. We've used many of them, and we continue to evaluate the ones we have not used. That was part one. Part two is, what can you do about fossil fuel production, I think is the question, not about reducing demand for fossil fuels, not about generation of clean energy, about fossil fuel production. And there, I think the president has taken action that stabilizes short-term supply and manages the long-term investment in long-term assets or long-term production in a way that is very responsible. If you look at the executive order that he issued on the first day he took office, around the pause, the direction, and then what subsequently the Interior Department did was to asked the Interior Department to integrate into the way it conducted its work a focus on managing against climate impacts over the long term, integrating that analysis into every individual decision. These statutes that we're talking about, right? The statute that governs the management of onshore lands is called the Mineral Leasing Act. It's not called the Manage How You Please Act. It's called the Mineral. So there's strong spin on the ball. And within that construct, in a way that hopefully is durable, the agency is working to raise royalty rates to make them more appropriate, to manage sensitive areas, manage areas that should not have leasing, and has been clear about taking certain areas off of availability. So I think this notion that there hasn't been this eye to what is the long-term trajectory and what we need to come off of is false. He's also proposed to reduce fossil subsidies and fossil backing of projects financing, both domestically and internationally. We are no longer doing that in the places where the president has discretion and authority, and in other places he's proposed to Congress the repeal of those subsidies, and Congress hasn't taken action. But I think we've got to just be candid about, we've got a system where we have a lot of actors, whether it's Congress that has put in directed lease sales into legislation, which then he's a rule of law person, he's going to have to follow faithfully what's in the laws, or places where he's exercised his discretion where the courts see the law differently and have, through injunction, required him, as the Louisiana court did, to hold lease sales. So if we want to report on, are there additional tools? Yes, there are additional tools. We are using them every single week. We announce additional action that moves us forward. Are there tools that are not efficacious? Yes, and we have to figure out whether there is an appropriate use for them. But are there lots of actors playing in this space? Yes. And then the last thing I'll say is, because you mentioned it, there are elements of this where the government gets locked in because of decisions that have been made over the course of decades. If you lease somebody acreage and you enter on behalf of the government into a contract that then provides rights, then over the course of decades, the government continues to take steps with the other party to allow them to spend money and build up their investment into something. In the U.S., courts look very unfavorably on pulling that plug and basically undermining the contract rights that are associated with it. So I think there is a really profoundly aggressive approach that the president's taking to tackle climate in a comprehensive way here and abroad. He's secured many new tools that make him more effective at doing that through the Inflation Reduction Act, but he hasn't stopped. Think about this. We passed the Inflation Reduction Act in August. A couple of months later, he passed the first bipartisan treaty, environmental treaty, through Congress in decades on the Kigali Amendment. A couple months later, his EPA proposed rules that would reduce emissions of methane from existing oil and gas production by 85%. A couple of months later, he made deposits into the Green Climate Fund and inaugurated an Amazon Conservation Fund through significant resources mobilized on behalf of the U.S. government. A couple months later, we proposed tailpipe standards that will reduce tailpipe emissions by half within a decade. So we're not stopping, including this week when we launched the American Climate Corps. So we're going to continue to keep going forward. And I think we're in dialogue with everybody who's got ideas, and we're in dialogue with our legal and analytical teams to figure out how we continue to find ways to move forward.
We literally have 2 minutes. One last quick question. We didn't get one from this side of the room.
Hi, my name's Helena. I'm at the New York Amsterdam News. Want your perspective on energy insecurity as someone who's served New York and in Washington. The federal government has had a long-time energy safety net for a home energy safety net program. that's administered by states, the low-income home energy assistance program. And it's something that is a safety net that's worked and helped a lot of people, but could go so much further. It's one issue with it is that of all the funds, it provides funding to help people stay warm in the winter, but also cool in the summer. Part of there was funding that came in during the pandemic to boost this program, but it's kind of come back to its normal. Is of all the funding that's coming towards this work, how much of it is there a push to make sure vulnerable Americans are getting protected when it comes to energy bills, when it comes to making sure they can stay warm, stay cool, especially when it kills us if we're not cool? Is there a push to fund this more? Is there a push to innovate that program so more funding goes to cooling, for example? I'm curious to hear, is more money going there, and is it headed, is it innovating in a way that meets how we're feeling climate now?
Yeah, I thank you for that question. There are so many Americans today who pay over 15 cents, and have for decades now, over 15 cents a kilowatt hour. That's substantially above the average around the country. It's oftentimes folks who live either in rural areas or in certain urban load pockets. And in other cases, even where they don't have those very high rates because of income and other demands, housing costs and others, there's a disproportionate energy burden. So here are a few things that we're doing about that. First, the program that you talked about, the low-income heating program, LIHEAP, we worked to expand that to cooling costs and send guidance across the states just a couple summers ago because we recognize that cooling is just as much of a concern and burden as heating is. We worked through the bipartisan infrastructure law and the American Rescue Plan to get, to your point, massive expansions in the funding, but we didn't stop there. Our annual request for LIHEAP is higher and continues to try to meet this increased demand. We're monitoring on a regular basis how much LIHEAP balances each state has so that we're working to meet this demand. I think you're absolutely right. This is going to be a heightened need, not necessarily a reducing one. Part of this is also getting at the drivers for the energy insecurity at the family level. Older housing stock, especially for fixed income seniors or low income folks, they don't have the upfront capital to do the retrofits we talk about, right? So we say, hey, you don't like your heating and cooling costs, you should just retrofit your home. Well, that's really hard even to put up. We've got tax credits, of course, we've got incentives, but folks say, well, I can't even put up the upfront capital to do this. That's why the president, through the Inflation Reduction Act, created over $9 billion program that's administered through the states that prioritizes low and moderate income, and for the lowest income Americans will foot the entire bill for the retrofit to cleaner appliances, to more efficient windows and doors. And so that will help take the pressure off of programs like LIHEAP over the long run because we're actually making the homes more efficient and we're doing it in a way that actually people can afford. Maybe this is a good way to close out here. Yeah. I mean, the impacts of climate change, I think, are, and the data, I think, support this, are felt disproportionately by folks who have the least means to adapt to it. And that, I think, makes the work of getting information out more important. And it requires us to tailor solutions in a way that will help address the challenge, whether it's through programs like LIHEAP, through the Zero Emission Homes rebate program, through efforts we have underway to literally reduce the technology cost of deploying this stuff. It shouldn't be as expensive to get out there. Through working with multifamily housing suppliers. This is not just something that should be for people who own their home. It should be people who rent their home or are on rental assistance. It's got to be for rural and tribal housing. And that's why we're making, as an administration, the biggest investment in the rural electricity service since the New Deal, because this challenge disproportionately hits folks in rural areas. But we've got to meet people where they are. Their bottom line is, are my energy costs going up or down? Clean energy can be a solution to that. Energy efficiency can be a solution to that. And a managed approach on the supply side is part of the solution to that. This president has never and will not have as his policy taking a approach to climate that does not work for the middle class and those who seek to be in it. He is always going to pursue a climate policy that lifts more people into the American middle class and strengthens it. We found a way to do that, and we're going to continue, as we've talked about now multiple times, we're going to continue to find more ways to do that and build on the progress using the tools that we have.
Ali Zaidi, thank you.
Thank you so much.
Appreciate it. I'll take that. I'll take it. Thank you all for your questions as well.
Stephanie, Ali Zaidi, thank you both so much. Let's give them one more round of applause. I gotta say, and I know we have some new faces in the room. My name is Zinhle Essamuah with NBC News. As a first-generation American, there's nothing I love more than what we just saw, right? Journalists getting to talk, frankly, with government officials. That's what it's about. And so, Stephanie, thanks for leading us in that conversation. I want to welcome up our next session. Of course, we're going to stay on politics and talk politics and climate ahead of the 2024 presidential election. So to moderate, please join me in welcoming Justin Warland, senior climate correspondent for Time Magazine, and panelist Alejandro Alba, senior correspondent at Now This News, Amy Goodman, the founder of Democracy Now!, Vanessa Hawk, an anchor at Telemundo and director of the program Planeta Tierra, and Al Ortiz, a longtime and recently retired executive and former VP of Standards at CBS News. Please join me in welcoming them.
Well, testing the, oh.
Okay. Well, thank you for the introduction. Glad to be here. I have to say, I remember being in this room 4 years ago at the launch of Covering Climate Now, and it's amazing to see how the organization has grown. Thrilled to be talking about politics and the 2024 election and climate change. Obviously, a lot is at stake, and we've got a great group here to dig into how we can cover this. And I'm just going to dive right in with a question for Amy. You know, obviously this panel assumes that covering climate in the context of the election is important, but I just want to start with you and ask, why is that the case? You know, do you agree with that assumption, and why?
Yes. First of all, it's a great honor to be with all of you. This is such a critical issue. I just came off of hosting Democracy Now! We do it down the street from 8 to 9 every weekday morning. And this week, the main focus, of course, has been climate. From the tens of thousands, perhaps over 70,000 people that marched on Sunday, being there out in the streets, talking to people beyond the government officials, though it is critical to bring those voices to that questioning of government officials, and then being out there at the protests that were taking place, the shutting down of the banks and the hundreds. In one protest, 149 people who were arrested. And I think my point here as we move into this key election year is to bring out the voices of people at the grassroots who are most deeply concerned about this. At Democracy Now! We say, going to where the silence is. Because I really think that is the majority voice. Look at the first Republican, vice presidential primary debate, or was it the presidential primary debate, whatever, who will be running with Trump. The video of the question of the young Republican man who asked Ramaswamy about, or the question went to Ramaswamy, and now he calls climate change a hoax. This cuts across the political spectrum. So all the work you all do around climate, you are not speaking to set chorus at this point. It's just some people who are willing to hear. It's generational, and of course older people also care. It's a learning moment where the candidates, you don't often get to see these public officials who've occupied public office having to respond to people in the street, people at town halls. And so this is the moment also for journalists to focus the questions on climate change. I mean, to say the least, we have had extreme weather events all over the world, so there's not a lack of coverage of weather. But also to demand of, for example, the meteorologists. That's why people tune into radio and TV, to find out what to wear, or can I go outside tomorrow? They talk about the rain, the drought, the torrential weather that we may be, who knows, experiencing this weekend. But to link it always, never take for granted, since you know so much about climate change, always to link these events when that is appropriate to climate change. We see the words extreme weather at every news desk. Well, there should be another 2 words, and that is climate change. It's absolutely critical for people because, as Noam Chomsky says, the media manufactures consent. And so it sets the agenda. I'll just end by saying I was on a panel with Bob Schieffer in a few years ago talking about the issue of climate in the 2016 presidential debate. That was the standoff at Standing Rock. Thousands of people, this epic gathering as they were protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline. Democracy Now! Went out there. In the general election debates, there was not one question on climate change. And I asked Bob about this. He said, okay, we've made a mistake. But when journalists ask those questions, it also legitimizes the issue so that people feel like they're not interrupting things to say this is a critical, if not the critical issue of the day.
Excellent. That lays the ground really well, and we'll pull on some of those threads. Al, I want to go to you, and I have to look at my notes to get your resume right. You were Washington bureau chief at CBS. You were executive producer on the Evening News, vice president of Standards. So you have a lot of you've had a long tenure working with the network's elections coverage.
A lot of scars, yes.
A lot of scars. Can you help us understand some of the obstacles to actually getting climate as part of elections coverage?
Well, the issue has been in the past that the polling has indicated that it is not the top issue on voters' minds when they're polled. Oftentimes it's the economy, it can be the price of gasoline, it can be more immediate things, but it's been moving up. And there's been quite a bit of change, I would say, in the last 5 years, over the last 10 years, in terms of people's interest in it. If you look at a poll from 4 years ago, 8 years ago, there wasn't a climate change question on the poll. Now they're in there. They're not always the first question, but that information is in there. People are asking themselves. There's a lot of information a lot of research that you can do in preparation for election coverage that can really help you. And studying what the polling shows and starting to show is really, really important. Not only that it's moving up in terms of an issue that people care about, but if you look at the breakdown of ages and groups of voters, the generational thing just shines through. I mean, clearly it's a bigger concern for younger voters. And that information is all in there. It just needs to be harvested and brought out and reported on. Just like right now, I mean, I think the most important thing to do to prepare for an election is to really do the research, get it right, study the records, the climate records and what they say and what they do of the various candidates. You can also find out who's contributing to these campaigns and what kinds of companies, what kind of business interests are behind these campaigns. The To me, it's striking that if you look at one party, there's not one candidate that has taken a stand really on climate change, as opposed to the other party who, even though the progress that the Democrats have made may leave us impatient, may not be enough to satisfy us, it's been something, and it's been worth noting. And you really can't lose sight of what's at stake is whether that continues to go forward or whether it's brought to a standstill for another 5 years.
You know, very, very important points. I want to turn to something you said about audiences. And I think there's sometimes a view that there's a monolithic audience that isn't interested in climate. And as you said, there are maybe some groups that are. And turn to Alejandro and ask, you know, you work for Now This, younger audience. What are you seeing in terms of interest in climate from younger, your audience?
Yeah, they care. They're extremely passionate. They're the people, for the most part, that turned up on Sunday to protest. But not only do they show up, they lead and they organize. They're just born passionate, and they do care about policy. They're constantly advocating about policy. And with our coverage specifically, we always try to make it personal, because there tends to be, sometimes in our comments we'll see where like, oh, y'all are just like liberal media, or like you're pushing an agenda, and it's like, well, no, if we take away kind of the politics a little bit and just make it specific to the people, to the youth, and what they're dealing with, the impact that they're having, it makes it a little bit more digestible and more engaging. And these groups of youth, they have a lot of power, purchase power, with their like parents and their family too. So they're influencing other ideologies and mindsets of older generations. So they care, they engage, and they help us push the importance of the climate crisis, really.
Great. And I would ask the same question to you, Vanessa. What are you seeing the audience at Telemundo? Are they engaged? What are you seeing?
Well, they're absolutely engaged, and as you have heard during all this conference, climate change is affecting everybody, but it's not affecting everybody equally. So it's disproportionately affected vulnerable communities, among them the Latino community. So, for example, for Latinos, half of the Latino population live in the 25 most polluted cities in the country. And our children are 40% more likely to suffer from asthma. So, and when we talk about our countries of origins, when we're hit by a natural disaster like Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico, or many others that had hit Central America, or the droughts in the dry corridor, we don't have the resources to rebuild as easily as other countries. So for us, it's something that is very, very, very important. And the wonderful thing in the Latino community is that that is a message that really resonates with us, because we are somehow connected to nature at a DNA level, and I see it when I do the stories at Noticias Telemundo. They're very well received because we have that connection. I remember when I was growing up, I will go to the market with my grandma, and we will never take a plastic bag. We will always take a little sack called costal to bring the groceries. And I remember my dresses were my sisters, and then they will go to my cousins, and this was just the way our culture is. So I think it really resonates with our community. And when you talk about voting, 9 out of 10 Latinos are actually willing to vote on legislation to protect the planet, even if it means paying more taxes. So we have to be creative as journalists to be able to tell this story in a way that it is compelling, that it has the facts, the numbers, but it also has that human voice that really gets to the heart of the people in a way that we can see it, we can plant a seed of concern that is authentic and that is powerful, that can really motivate change and action.
Great. Well, I just want to ask one follow-up. You were in 2020 the first climate journalist to help moderate a presidential debate. And I don't really have a very specific question, but I just want to know about what that experience was like, and what learnings you took from that are applicable perhaps to other national audiences.
it was very explosive, to say the least. It was the only
Yes.
debate that we have Mike Bloomberg on. So it was an amazing opportunity. I've been covering climate for the past 20 years, and for me, it's a very, very personal issue. So I felt a great responsibility. I really wanted to bring climate to the center stage, and I really wanted to give it substantial time for candidates to be able to explain what were their plans and what were their proposals to face this existential crisis that we're facing. But I knew also that historically climate is not a priority on a debate stage. In the 2016 election, Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton only talked about climate for about 5 minutes, and the 2012 election, President Obama and Mitt Romney didn't even mention the subject. So I was very concerned. I really prepared my questions. I pitched 20 questions to our leadership, and really pushed forward our teams to understand that this was the issue of our times, really the subject that we needed to talk about. And I was very, very fortunately that our leadership at Telemundo, at NBC and MSNBC and CNBC, that were the ones that organized the debate, they were on the same page, and they understood the science, and they understood that this was an important matter for the audiences. So we ended up asking 10 questions about climate and talking for 20 minutes about it, and it was unprecedented.
Yeah, it's great. I want to go to something, Al, you said about, you said it very clearly. There's one party that maybe is moving too slowly but is engaged, and there's one party that's not. As a climate journalist, I feel totally comfortable writing that, saying that. I don't have some of the same fears perhaps that a political journalist might about being branded as too partisan, or perhaps not having any Republican sources who will speak to them. How do you, on a very sort of practical level, how do you advise a reporter who's grappling with how to communicate honestly on this issue and on where the parties are and where candidates are, but they're concerned about being able to do their job?
I think you stick to the facts. There is a natural reluctance by professional journalists, including those of us who are reporting on climate. There's a natural reluctance to get into something that's political, that we feel like we're going to be tarnished by, as if we're taking sides in the election over something that's the science behind it's incontrovertible. But I think we have to get over that. It is a political story. It is partly political. It involves making tough political choices, tough economic choices, tough social choices, changing policies, tax policies. There's a lot of political decisions that have to go into this. And I think it's unrealistic to think that you can just approach it from a clinical, scientific point of view. Here are the facts, everybody's going to make up their own minds. The fact is that if you have, I'm going to go out on a limb here, but the fact is that if you have the Republican Party take over both the executive and legislative branches of government, you're going to stop climate change policy in the government for 5 years. And we don't have 5 years to lose. We're way past that. And I think it's important to remind people of that. And you're not going to get that in every story. You're not going to get that in every debate. But the fact is, the timing thing is so urgent that I think you need to be clear about the fact that these are, one side is on one side of the issue, and the other side's on another, at least making some progress, and that it's not something that can be depoliticized.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important to stick to the facts, and finding a way to just articulate what the stakes are without sounding partisan. Did you want to jump in?
I mean, just look at what Mark Hertzgaard did. This is a Biden climate person, and it's doing the exact same thing with the Republicans and the Democrats. and that is challenging them, asking them questions, whoever's in power, who's ever setting the policy. I think you are consistent across the board. It doesn't matter which administration is in. And also just responding to something you said, Al, about how, the concern of media outlets over the years that people's eyes glaze over when you ask something about climate change, though it's changed over the years. When we were covering the standoff at Standing Rock, we got video footage, came back, posted it online of these protests against yet another pipeline being built, a Dakota Access Pipeline. Within 24 hours, there were 14 million views of what was going on. And I think that showed that people around the globe and the United States deeply do care. And it's not just an evolution on the part of the electorate that we should catch up with. The media also affects people's interests. Like you're asking those questions, which was so critical, ignites people's interest and fuels the next question to be asked. And it taps into an audience that really does care and knows it's legitimate to ask about these things. When we were covering the Paris Climate Agreement, we went to the UN Climate Summit, and Democracy Now! Goes every year. This year, it's in UAE, right? The president will be the head of the UAE oil corporation, which is absolutely astounding, which has to be raised at every moment. We're moving into this election year. Everyone should be talking about this as we talk about how the planet, the US, China, et cetera, deals with the climate crisis. When we were covering Paris in 2015, that was right after the Bataclan massacre, terrible terrorist attack. So all the anchors of the news shows went to Paris. So when we're coming into the airport for the climate summit, they're all leaving. And I thought it's appropriate that they came here to anchor from Paris. They're concerned because so many people died, were killed. Absolutely, that was legitimate. But why aren't they staying? Look at the effect of the climate catastrophe and the number of people who die around the world. Why didn't they stay for the seminal climate summit, 2015, the Paris Agreement? And we have to make it unacceptable for journalists, even general political journalists, not to ask questions, about these issues. And also, again, hold meteorologists' feet to the fire. That when they talk about extreme weather, and I'm just going to keep hammering away at this because the more, many of those meteorologists were climate deniers. You have Chad Myers, who just wrote a piece a few years ago. He said, yeah, okay, I was. And I'm slowly changing, he said. But when you look at CNN's coverage, so I'm not talking about Fox, that calls climate change a hoax. I'm talking about CNN, I'm talking about NBC. When you look at their coverage, it's how many times they raise that issue, especially with weather. Don't assume people link these very diverse weather events. It's up to us to do that.
Excellent. I lost my train of thought. The one thing I wanted to add on to what Al said, and then I'm going to come back to something that you said, Amy, but is separating advocating, or not advocating, but pushing for or saying that we need action on climate and advocating for a particular solution. And I think that's, for me, something that I find very useful in saying it's not about A policy or B policy that we need to enact, but we do need to do something. I see a look of skepticism, but I think it's an important point as a journalist to say you can advocate for the climate in a broad sense, but I'm not advocating for any particular policy. My personal perspective. There was something that you said, Amy, about I can't remember whether it was Keystone or Dakota Access. You said Dakota Access, where you got a lot of engagement. And I think there's this myth that climate stories don't resonate. Perhaps it's true in some abstract sense if we write about levels of carbon dioxide, but there are ways to find engagement. So we have about 5 minutes before we go to audience question. I would love to hear from each of you about story threads coming up that you think will have resonance with audiences, things that you're working on, and perhaps that others might also pick up on those similar threads. And we can just start with you, Alejandro, and move along.
Well, something, because I'm working on it right now, but it's kind of breaking down the project 2025 and just visualizing it, because with a lot of stories, I think within the environment and climate, we see a lot of stats, we see a lot of figures, and sometimes it just stays at that. And so what we try to do at Now This, and because we have a very specific, unique platform, is trying to visualize it with people and actually humanizing all of these news. So what the IRA has done, and then what this plan would take away.
And just Project 2025, most of you probably know, but it's the conservative plan to take everything back.
Yeah. So basically ways to dismantle all the progress that has been done, specifically within climate and environment, the IRA. So I'm finding ways to visualize what we would be losing if this would to be enacted. And I think that's a good way to visualize. And if we find key players that would be impacted, that would resonate a lot with our audiences and people beyond.
Do you think there's a lot of talk about sort of optimism versus anger versus different emotions you might stoke, or that readers might latch onto in a story? And so do you find, are you thinking that you'll activate anger in people thinking about Project 2025, or is that part of your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you say that, because emotion is something that we think about a lot. All of our audience constantly is talking about climate anxiety, climate hope, climate anger. Again, our audience is very, very passionate, which is a good thing. And I think both. I think one could lead to the other. So I think it could start with anger. And sometimes, I do present a story with a certain way, like, hey, this might piss you off, but wait, hold on, there is a solution, or there could be hope. There could be a conversation. It's not just stopping at doom and gloom, because then we're not going anywhere with that.
Great. Amy?
One is following the money, especially during not only the presidential race, but at every level, who is funding these candidates. And also, especially with the corporate media, I'm sure it's very difficult for those of you who work in it, because of the amount of advertising that comes from the very institutions that are financing, the whole climate change crisis. And following the lead of young people as they go after banks, in the same way you go after government officials, follow where they are going. I get the feeling in certain newsrooms that people who propose stories, there's going to be this protest on this day, feel that they get marginalized as they climb the ladder in their newsroom if they say, I want to go cover this. That's exactly where you should go to. It's not just when a government policy is announced. Let those people who are deeply concerned about this set the agenda as well. Those are news events. And again, as we lead to this climate summit in the UAE, one of the things we'll be focusing on is the global connection. It's something that unites people around the world, and as Vanessa pointed out, it's absolutely critical to talk not just about the frontline communities, but the fence line communities who are closest to these fossil fuel plants, communities of color, the poorest communities in our country and around the world.
Great. Vanessa?
Well, I think climate is definitely a systemic issue that is affecting every single aspect of our lives. So as you just say, Amy, we need to connect the dots for our audiences. So it is a political story, obviously, because we are choosing the people that are going to lead the policies that are going to make a difference and set up the platforms for all of us citizens to live sustainable lives. So it depends a lot on us that we have an educated audience that can actually vote on those people that are going to have their best interests in mind. It is an economic story because it affects every family. It is, everything, like the food that we put on the table, the droughts that are happening in Central America, they are affecting the United States because we are seeing climate migrants that are coming here because they have no other way to go after 2, 3, 4 years that they lost everything that they have, all their harvest. So I think that when we connect the dots and we really go in depth, we're able to tell a story that resonates with the audiences. And I think the climate story is not an easy story. We have to be creative. We have to look for beautiful images, for compelling stories, for powerful voices. We have to look at the data, as you just mentioned, the numbers. We have to find scientific experts that can tell the story in a clear way. So there is a lot of elements, but I think without a doubt that this is the most important story of our times. So I just invite you all to really get involved and do great journalism, because it's a great challenge, but it's also a great opportunity for us.
Okay, great. And we'll have Al, and then we'll go to audience questions. So think about questions.
One thing that you mentioned, Vanessa, I think one of the compelling political stories of this cycle is immigration, and it's one where the connection is not often drawn to climate change. The fact is that these waves of immigration that we see happening in various parts of the world are happening because of crop failures, because of agricultural policies that are going awry, because there's not enough water falling. I mean, there's a lot of it's not the only problem, the cause of immigration problems and these migrations, but it's a connection that needs to be made and that we need to make. I just want to say I'm very mindful of the fact that we're going out to a lot of countries and different organizations. We are so fortunate in this country to be doing these jobs under the protection of the First Amendment. And it's just something that not a lot of societies have. I know I have colleagues who, if they were to question their government's policies on climate, on immigration, whatever, they could be silenced or worse. We have that protection, and therefore we have that obligation to raise this, keep it prominent in the public eye, to make the connections that we're talking about, and we really need to lead because we have that ability in our profession here in this country. I really think we have a special responsibility to push that through.
Very important. I actually want to make one addition, just because this is on my mind, and I think it's something I hope other journalists follow, is the nascent push from Republicans to link climate policy with inflation. And you see this across the country in communities, conversation about, your energy prices are spiking because of climate policy. And I think that misinformation is something that people should be paying attention to, particularly in local communities where these things are likely to catch on. Sorry you had such a good comment to end on, but I felt that was an important story thread to follow. So, okay, questions. We'll go up here.
Hello. Oh, thank you. My name is Camille Padilla from 9 Millones in Puerto Rico. And first of all, thank you so much for this panel. And I'm really thinking about who gets to report about climate, and in the context of election too. How important do you think, you're talking about covering communities on the ground, that the reporters share those experiences, understand, are connected? How do we make sure to have inclusive newsrooms of the people who are most affected by this?
It's a good question. Does anybody want to take it?
I could think of, again, just kind of living within the uniqueness of social media and going with the trends of just, for example, like now everything's presented in like the TikTok way, right? It's just like selfie, you talk to the camera, green screen in the background. It's like knowing when to pass the mic. Not I, as an on-camera correspondent, I don't always have to tell the story. I now have the ability to literally just give my phone to someone and help them tell their story. So just literally offer your platform. I think that is something that I'd like to see more across the board. It doesn't always have to be the reporter telling the story. And I think we are now, as a society, able to do that more, just lending out platforms.
Mm-hmm. I would like to ask Camille that, it's absolutely vital to have diversity in our newsroom, because when things are happening in our communities, in our own communities, well, first of all, it's about representation. The Latino population is growing. We have an African American community that is strong, and we need to have representation of all those voices in our newsroom. But also, when a tragedy hits, Puerto Rico, for example, who else than you that know that community, that know what they are going through, is going to be best to tell the story of that community? So, so definitely there is no climate justice, and we have heard over and over again in this conference, without representation, without diversity, and without inclusion. So I think all those aspects definitely needs to be incorporated into our news departments.
It's absolutely essential. It's an absolutely key issue, both in your newsroom being represented and also the people that you interview, because that's who people see on TV and radio and on social media, that you have this great diversity of voices.
Great. Another question, okay.
Hi, given that a lot of the people that are the most passionate about climate change aren't old enough to vote yet, and I was one of those people not that long ago and remember that feeling deeply, how can we as journalists help those people as the election, which can be a very stressful time when you feel helpless and like your voice doesn't matter, have a playbook for influencing their families and helping their families understand why this issue matters more to them than, say, the economy, or say whichever issue is at top of mind for their parents but isn't at top of mind for the younger generation in the house?
Another good question.
Well, what is your name? Nina, great to meet you. Thank you for the question. I think, I mean, you have a very powerful voice. I'm a mother, and really in my home, the boss is my 2-year-old daughter. I'm a 28-year-old boy. So really, I think definitely, I mean, your generation understand and really gets what the problem is and the great challenge that we have. You are fighting for a livable planet. And that is something that we all, I mean, the older generation here, we never have to do. So I think the best advice would be to educate yourself and to really understand the climate crisis and talk to your parents about it, and talk to your community, and talk to your uncles and your grandpas, and let them know why this is so vital. And I'm sure that you will be able to find common ground, because there is nothing that we love more than our children. And I'm sure that they will be able to understand your message and the importance of it.
I think it's very similar to the question about diversity. I think that just as you need to have diverse people in the field reporting on areas that are suffering some of the worst consequences of climate change right now, you also need to seek out stories about younger voters and younger, people who are voting for the first time, or who have families, just starting families, and as I said, the polling data is available. You can find this stuff out and identify targets to go after, but I think you have to intentionally seek out these people and give them voice in your stories.
We just covered the major decision out of Montana, the lawsuit brought by, I think it was a group of young people from the ages of 5 to 22, who sued the state of Montana for violating their constitutional rights for to be able to live in the world for a sustainable future, and they won. So there's all sorts of things they can do outside of voting, and all of those things affect those who vote as well, and being involved in organizations and clubs and protests. Also, I just want to say it's very important for journalists to accept how people define themselves. For example, at Standing Rock, they did not call themselves protesters. They called themselves water protectors. They call themselves land defenders. And that is critical. It changes the whole frame of what they are doing.
Great. Okay.
Amy, I so appreciate that you brought up so many different actions as examples throughout this panel. I mentioned yesterday, I've been on the front lines. My name is Jen Thompson. I'm from SJAN, but I'm really not speaking on anybody's behalf but my own. But more specifically in Portland, Oregon. So through the murder of George Floyd, rallies for Stop Asian Hate, increased actions for the Land Back movement, even actions in solidarity for the Atlanta forest where they're trying to build Cop City. All of these spaces in which I've experienced and witnessed really heavy police violence. Thinking about climate, how imperative it is to acknowledge intersectionality in this space. How do you all feel about involving cops at climate protests by obtaining permits for actions? Do you feel like it potentially alienates marginalized folks from having the accessibility to attend? And do you feel it's imperative for cops to be around in order for journalists to successfully do their jobs?
This is COPS versus the UN COP, the Conference of Parties, the UN Climate Summit.
Police.
I mean, I just want to say one thing about Cop City. That's a perfect example that in Atlanta, they are trying to build the largest police training facility in the country. And when you talk about intersectionality, all the different groups, whether we're talking about those who are countering police violence, to environmentalists and indigenous people who are deeply concerned about the environment it is being built in, to those who want to have the whole Atlanta community have a vote, a referendum on whether this should happen and whether the money should be going there or to preserving the climate, etc. It is key that we see increasingly the issue of how all of these issues are interrelated, and so often climate is a part of that. And to heighten that, those expressions, because it's usually the gamut across the political spectrum, across groups, religious groups as well, that take on all of these issues together and don't let that one be very conscious as climate reporters. I mean, even to call yourself a climate reporter, I think you're a general reporter who's deeply concerned about the issue of our day. I mean, what did Antonio Guterres say this week? Humanity has opened the gates of hell.
Great, okay.
Hi, my name is Rebecca Weston. I'm from the Climate Psychology Alliance of North America. I'm not actually a journalist, but I'm so moved by some of the questions here and sort of following up on some of those. My perspective is that if we don't address the deep anxiety and the overwhelm that is happening around the country, not only are we missing the activists, but we're not tracking the very serious and deadly right-wing responses that are starting to happen. And I'm thinking about eco-fascism. I'm thinking about the level of militarization that's happening at protests. And I'm curious how the media is wanting to connect, not just on the left, but the right-wing responses that are doubling down, not just sort of in the softer denialism, but actually starting to turn it into a forceful, we have a right to be taking over our property, we have a right to exclude. And I'm curious if people can make the connection more explicitly to potential authoritarian and fascist threats, which I think are which are rising. We know they're rising. I'm curious how you guys would respond to that.
Well, I'll respond to it briefly just because this is an area that I'm actively thinking about and reporting on. I think it's so important. I think it's one of the, I think it's, if you look at what's happening in Europe, where they spent a lot of time thinking about, how can we meet our 2050 targets and where does that mean we need to be? And then they've made climate policy around that. And, that's had some social effects, which has then led to political backlash in places like the Netherlands, Spain. This is really serious. I mean, how do we report on that? I think, the challenge, of course, is trying to get the real life connections, the people on the ground who are going to show how serious and dangerous this is. And I think one of the challenges, I think there are a few challenges. One, I think there's sort of a embedded skepticism from, at like an editor level about drawing those sorts of connections. And then two is making it non-academic, because there's a lot of research about this, but it really, needs to enter the sort of bigger narrative. And so, I guess I would say we just kind of have to do the reporting, and I'm keen on that. I think that others should be too. So that's my response. Okay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I think the theme of connection seems to be coming up a lot in this panel. And I just want to go back to something that was brought up at the very beginning. Al, you mentioned that debates and things, if we're going back to the political polling of audiences, you're talking about the price of gasoline, et cetera, these push button issues. How, as journalists, can we connect those push-button issues that audiences want to hear about? How can we connect that back to climate change? And is it not our responsibility to do so?
Well, I think the connections are, unfortunately, climate change is a story that doesn't stay down and out of the headlines for very long at all. It has a way of rearing up several times a month in terms of disasters and affecting different areas of life, whether it be food security or any number of issues. I think it's coming up. I think it's happening. It's with such rapidity on so many different levels that keeping up with it, with these waves of headline news and headline disasters, is one way of making these connections. I mean, when I sort of first became climate aware about 8 years ago, I thought, oh, well, these are great TV stories. They're going to walk on the air. We're going to have no trouble getting these things, getting people to follow these things. Well, it turns out not to be the case. It doesn't take very long for with our short attention spans, stories to become sort of old news, and you're constantly looking for new angles and new approaches and ways to tell that story. So I think that that's a really important thing, is to always be on the watch for new connections, new angles that are coming up, as I said, oftentimes, several times a month in different parts of the world, so that you're telling the story or calling the attention to the connections of climate change in a fresh way, and not making people feel like you're doing the same story over and over again.
Great.
I mean, I would also just say, when it comes to the cost of transition, of renewables, you just compare it to the cost of the climate catastrophe. And everyone understands, I mean, this is perhaps one of the greatest roles of government. You have to move in when there's a disaster. So it's costing all of us billions of dollars when Lahaina is decimated in Hawaii, when the Gulf Coast in Florida. We are paying for this. What could be more expensive?
Great. Okay.
Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for all this insight. My name is Jessie Mitchell. I'm with CBS 2. I'm actually the Harlem community reporter, so I do a lot of work in this community on environmental justice. Some of us in many of these newsrooms are maybe one or two of the few people that actually care about this subject. What's your best advice for making everybody care? I know the guys from Miami said that the documentaries that they did really changed the perspective of everybody in the newsroom. I mean, we've done a couple documentaries ourselves, but how do you get everybody feeling this level of energy towards action?
Well, I think it's something that is going to happen more and more, because, as you just said, Mother Nature definitely have the stronger voice in this debate. And unfortunately, even if we follow the Paris Agreement and we cut emissions by half by 2030 and we go net zero by 2050, even if we cut emissions today by zero, we are going to feel the effects of a warming planet in the next couple of decades. So these stories are not going anywhere. I mean, we're going to see it more and more, and I think this is what has been changing the perception of the people. I think it's extremely important, if you love this subject and this is your beat, your thing, to create. I am the director of Planeta Tierra, that is our environmental research unit, and it took me 12 years to be able to make it happen. And now we're working for 7 years. And if you have a platform and people, your unit, that work on this subject, that understand the importance of climate, that bring this story on the general days, I mean every day on your conference call, that can actually connect the dots. That, for example, if you're saying, okay, the Lahaina was completely decimated, but wait a minute, I mean this part of the island have been in a terrible drought for the past couple of years, or that really can bring that light of climate into the different story, because really it affects every single aspect of our lives. is going to help for your newsroom to understand that this is a very important issue. I think we all need, in our newsrooms, we all need an expert on this subject. We all need, as journalists, to understand the science, to understand where we are and what we need to do, to understand the resources that we have available. We need to be knowledgeable on the subject because this is not something that is going to go away.
I'd also just say that if you have an analytics and insight team, like I feel like a lot of reporters sometimes don't have an access to that team, but they can help you inform your next story or find that connection between the two. Whether it's a baseball story, a specific kind of wood that's used for a bat that makes your favorite player score home runs, like that's endangered now. So like there's a connection there. And so kind of finding different, there's a connection to climate in every other vertical. Sports, entertainment, Netflix is always talking about carbon neutral. So just finding those connections and then seeing what your audience is saying and your replies. If you don't have an insights team, just literally go on your YouTube comments. I'm always in the comments seeing what the connections are and what people are asking for. And I think that could help increase the newsroom's interest into these stories. Or I think how yesterday we were saying in one of the panels where it's maybe it's just one line. You don't have that much time, you don't have much that bandwidth, but just adding one line to make the connection. And I think that could increase just the overall interest.
Mm-hmm. I do find it's the same thing as trying to connect with audiences in some ways. You're trying to connect with your newsroom. You're like, what is this editor interested in? How can I frame it to make sure they see the connection? I think we have time for maybe one more question. I don't know. Okay, yes.
Hi, Rima Dial, WSHU Public Radio in Fairfield, Connecticut. For those of us who work with communities of color and immigrant communities during the elections, these communities rely a lot on news from their countries of origin. And as Al mentioned, in many of those countries, there is a lot of misinformation and disinformation around climate change and what they're allowed to say. And maybe, Vanessa, you can speak to this. How can we better, for those of us in this country, connect the dots better for those communities to understand the impact of the reality of climate change, especially for the global South and the families that are also here?
Thank you so much for your question, very important. Definitely is a challenge. I think that we are going through a very special time for journalism because of all this disinformation era that we're going through. I think my best advice is to really understand what is going on and keep doing stories about it to educate your audiences, for them to understand that this is our reality, this is what is happening. It's not only the facts, the numbers, but present personal stories that can make them understand that this is the reality. On the other hand, when you think about what is happening today, it's absolutely unbelievable that we have a certain political party that is willing to defend fossil fuels or to say that they are good and that they save life or to deny the climate change is happening. It is absolutely absurd that we have to go through that as journalists. But they are willing to distort the truth in your face when you are doing an interview or when you are in a debate. So I think that we have to be extremely prepared to face that because it's difficult to be fact-checking everybody. When you're doing an interview, to fact-checking somebody all the time. But at the end of the day, we have to. We have to put light on the truth. And if they say that fossil fuels are saving life more than climate policy, you really need to have the strong argument to come back and say, no, that is not the reality, that is not true, and this is why. Because if we don't do it, if we don't expose what is not true, then our communities, our audiences are going to believe that, maybe the guy is right, what he's saying is right. So I think it is very, very important that we are prepared to really bring the light on the truth in these times.
Excellent. Well, that's all the time we have, but thank you for this excellent discussion.
It's wonderful.
All right, thank you again, Justin, Alejandro, Amy, and Vanessa, and Al for that discussion. We have one more panel, guys. We're getting close here. So I want to now, our next session is an awe-inspiring story about the power of collaboration. We were all talking about collaboration a lot yesterday. So please welcome to the stage Ben Winslow, senior reporter of Fox 13 News and Great Salt Lake Collaborative, and Amy Maestas, the director of collaboratives at Solutions Journalism Network. You guys ready? You can go on up.
Oops, sorry.
Good morning. We're here, as was just said, to tell an inspiring story about journalists collaborating, not only with each other, but among the communities and audiences that they serve. The collaboratives that are funded by the Solutions Journalism Network is under the Local Media Project, which is a 5-year or multi-year initiative funded by the Knight Foundation and the Ralph C. Wilson Foundation, which has charged SJN to bring together 15 collaboratives in the U.S. to cover a specific topic in a specific place that brings together the journalists from different platforms, digital, print, radio, television, to cover a single topic for 2 years, working together to break down walls of competition and to bring in community and civic organizations, not those that are political, but those that can help tell the story of a particular subject that each collaborative has selected. Our collaboratives are not prescriptive. They rely completely on what each collaborative area, the topic that they have selected, to engage their audiences, to use new technology to tell these stories. And in Salt Lake City, the chosen topic is the shrinking Great Salt Lake. The video and the images you are seeing here are a combination of story reporting together with journalists working on stories together, rallies, and most especially the shrinking Great Salt Lake. You can see the issue and why it's important. Ben will talk about his participation.
Yeah, so the Great Salt Lake has dropped to its lowest point in recorded history since the state was founded. Back in 1847, they started recording the levels. It's a result of a number of factors. There's water diversion, there's drought, and of course the changing climate. It's not hyperbole to say that the threats are existential. One of the naturally occurring minerals in the lake bed is arsenic. We have toxic dust storms, and the climate scientists we've talked to have said, oh, it won't kill you right away, but give it 20 or 30 years and you might have like a new form of cancer. So it's just something to be aware of. We have reduced snowpack, which affects our economy and our water supply. Ski Utah, the greatest snow on earth, that's kind of important to us. So when this dust hits the snow, it can speed the snow melt faster. Less water, less snow, that's a multi-billion-dollar economy. There's harms to public health, there's wildlife. The Great Salt Lake is an important migratory bird refuge globally. So the situation presents a real threat to our state, and we are one of the fastest growing states in the nation, so it is significant, and there's no easy answers. When you say, well, just get more water into the lake, well, one of the issues is that triggers a multitude of questions about how you handle growth, development, how you handle just getting water supplies, increasing demands and stress for all of that, and just the multitude that it is. So there's no real easy answers, which is why it's great that we're working on these solutions.
The collaborative, the Great Salt Lake Collaborative has 20 partners. They include not just news organizations, but also such thing as higher education institute, environmental institutes. There are a couple of dance groups that have done some dance performances based on the journalism that the Great Salt Lake Collaborative has done about the lake, and they have engaged new audiences that they individually would not have engaged. So the collective wisdom and the collective working together has reached people to not only care about the lake, but they are learning about what's being done to address the problems with the lake and what they can do themselves. And they're doing it through a solutions lens. And we often say that solutions journalism is accountability journalism. As people learn about what can be done, who's done it better, who's gone elsewhere, Ben will talk about some of the places and the reporting trips he has done about that. They can then have enough agency to be participants and informed citizens to hold the policymakers, the legislature, people around them who have the power to make changes, hold them accountable.
So I'm going to admit that I was really skeptical of solutions journalism when it was first presented to me, because I viewed it as activism and advocacy, which is stuff that, as journalists we're told, you don't do. But the Great Salt Lake is such a pressing issue for my community that, we needed to keep people informed. People need to know what's happening with the lake and how it impacts them in their daily lives. And quite frankly, one news outlet can't do it alone. I work for a TV station in Salt Lake City, but not everybody watches my station. So the Great Salt Lake Collaborative has been great about that. We got into solutions journalism and pointing out potential solutions that can help people, things that people can do, things that other communities have done that might work or might not work for our community. The Great Salt Lake Collaborative is fantastic because it spans audiences by reaching people through a multitude of platforms. And as we said, one outlet can't do it alone. We've really put aside a lot of our competitive rivalries because we believe the public is better informed if we're all focusing on the same issue. We share each other's work. I work for the Fox affiliate in Salt Lake City, and as I mentioned, not everybody watches my station. But my work has also appeared on the NBC affiliate, the community radio station KRCL. I've had my work republished in the Ogden Standard Examiner, the Salt Lake Tribune, the Deseret News, NPR affiliate KUER, et cetera, because people aren't exactly watching my station, or they're maybe not watching or reading another one, and it's vice versa. It works all the way around, but my reporting, they get our reporting, they get my reporting, I get their reporting. We've repurposed each other's stories to inform our respective audiences. And this is another thing that I really like about this. We've been able to pool our resources and do some special reporting. So I went recently to Las Vegas with Utah Public Radio's Sherry Quinn, Salt Lake Tribune photographer Trent Nelson, and the photographer with me, Eric Brown, and we went to Las Vegas. It's a community that has some very, very strict landscaping laws because of their water crises. We did a series of reports on what they're doing. Could that work for our community as we deal with landscaping and people using lawns or using water in a very arid state with the love of grass that we do have? It was a great solutions journalism type story. We've been able to go to California, the collaborative, and look at the dried out lakes there. What can people expect if they don't make changes? It also, being a part of the collaborative, opens doors and creates access. I went as a one-man band to Israel with a state delegation. The collaborative was able to negotiate for a seat with state leaders as they went to Israel to look at how that country went from a nation of water scarcity to a nation of water surplus. Could some of the policies that Israeli government officials have enacted work for us? And in that situation, it wasn't just we were all doing our own individual broadcast print type stories. It was I did the print, I did the broadcast, I did the digital, provided my interviews to other stations if they wanted to use those. Photographs that I took went to the digital and print outlets for them to use as they needed. So it's been great for that. And we also leverage our respective beats. So for example, I cover Capitol Hill in Utah. I cover politics. So I have a lot of experience talking to government officials and breaking down budget reports or looking into bill filings and the impacts of those policies. I'm not an environmental reporter normally. I kind of feel like I am now, but I'm not traditionally. But I'm able to leverage what I have from Utah's Capitol Hill and give that to the collaborative so that other reporters can also use that. I work with some fantastic environmental reporters. I think of the Salt Lake Tribune's Leah Larson, Amy Joey O'Donoghue at the Deseret News. They are more attuned to environmental issues and things like that. So it's been great because we can combine our experiences. We can combine our expertise to tell a better story and to collaborate truly. This week, interestingly enough, I found an audit footnote that estimates, you see some of the exposed lake beds here. Dust mitigation in Utah, the legislative auditor general found starting cost for dust mitigation would be $1.5 billion with $15 million annual costs year after year after year, and the cost skyrockets the more lake bed is exposed. It was a story I was able to contribute to the collaborative and obviously inform more people about the very real risks that we have and why we should address those. I will say on the collaborative, it's not always perfect. Sometimes we feel like some of us do more than others, and but we still compete too. I want you to know, we don't just end the rivalries or anything like that. We're still competitive, but it is really nice to know that we have each other's backs and that we're all working toward a common goal, which is to inform Utahns about the situation facing the Great Salt Lake.
The impact of the collaborative has been swift. Since it started in 2022, the legislature over 2 sessions has allotted $1 billion over those 2 legislative sessions to address problems with the lake and solutions to it. Much of it influenced by the reporting that the collaborative has done together, because they've been able to do much more than one news outlet alone can do. That's the unique model that we have with our collaboratives, is not every news organization needs to go it alone, and they cannot be complete in their storytelling of it. The collaborative, the project manager, Heather May of the collaborative, this year has secured $100,000 in additional funding for the collaborative to continue beyond 2 years with the SJN Local Media Project. And it has reached audiences that it never did before. Some of those are communities of color, and in one instance, young people. The journalism that the collaborative has done inspired a grant from the state to take the stories and turn it into curriculum to teach 5th grade students in public schools. So those audiences, it's even gotten younger because they're learning now about what's happening to the lake and the future generations, what they can do to address it. And Ben can share a couple of instances about what he hears from the public.
Yeah, and it is really great. The nice thing about this is the public is reacting. We have some public opinion surveying that shows 80% of Utahns care about the Great Salt Lake and its future and what happens to it. I did a story recently. We can see these boots on the ground impact of. I did a story recently about a new drought-friendly grass blend that has been created, and doing the story, the publicity made it a hit. It sold out, and it's been selling out. They're now on their 2nd year. They're going into their 3rd year. And people want this stuff. And that's kind of a nice feather in your cap, because you're like, hey, I did a story and it got a lot of reaction. People actually went and made a change, a positive change for them and for the environment. I volunteer for the collaborative at the downtown Salt Lake City Farmers Market. So it's really nice to hear from people directly also. When you're just sitting there manning a booth and handing out stickers, which I brought for people if you want some too, about how much they appreciate the work. People are paying attention, and it is motivating them to make changes both in their individual daily lives, but they also like to tell me how much they disagree with our legislature and our political leaders about the actions that they're taking. And that's also great too, because you kind of get that first person from people about what they're feeling. And people have given me questions that I can take to political leaders and ask and get answers, and kind of follow up with people in the broader audience sense of letting them know, we are taking your questions to political leaders to try to hold them accountable, to find out the policies that they're enacting and how they impact you.
You can find more about our collaboratives on SJN's website, and you can find more about the Great Salt Lake Collaborative at greatsaltlakenews.org. They have an excellent newsletter that is sent out every week that shares not only the stories that they've done, but how they're working together. And they're constantly sharing not only the work that they've done, but the culture change in newsrooms, having broken down the competition among the news partners and how the community is involved. And you can find Ben for a sticker that has the Great Salt Lake Collaborative mascot, which is a brine shrimp. Thank you.
Save the brine shrimp.
And Ben gets one more huge round of applause. We need to celebrate you, Ben, because Ben, along with the rest of the Great Salt Lake Collaborative crew, just won Excellence in Collaboration and Partnership Award online from the Online News Association. So congratulations. Where'd you go? Oh, there you are. Congratulations. Thank you. Good stuff, guys. Really good stuff.
Really good stuff, not just for him, but the whole 2 days. So thank you all for the ways that you have engaged, the ways you've asked smart questions and continued to just communicate and keep the dialogue going online. We appreciate it, and we're sad that we're kind of at the end.
I know. It was really, really fun, and it was so great meeting everyone. But we're not finished yet. We still have one more thing. We're going to take a short networking break, and the team is going to get set up for the Blueprint workshop group. So if you go into the World Room, they were asking everyone if they could, hamburger, hot dog, shuffle their buns a little quickly over to the World Room so they could change this room. When you go over there, you're going to see a slide with the different topics. So check those out, and then they'll get you guys back in, and everyone will start to collaborate in those groups.
Before you start moving, we do want to encourage you to attend the working group that appeals to your interests the most. You will also be free to move between groups during the hour. Magdala Mascal and Angela Evans, who actually led yesterday's town hall, they're going to be there to help you wherever you need to go and help facilitate as well.
All right, it's been a pleasure on behalf of me and Zinhle and the whole team. Thank you, guys.
Thanks so much.